Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. So my talk's gonna be about a study we conducted almost about 4 years ago. So it's pre-pandemic, looking at both the ventilation and common exposures in nail salons in New York City. So I know we have a big West Coast audience, but out on the East Coast, New York City is one of the highest concentration of nail salons in the country. I'll show you a picture coming up, but I mean, basically you can't walk around a block in Manhattan without seeing a nail salon. Just in Manhattan alone, there's 800 nail salons in that borough. And there's about 2,000 nail salons throughout New York City. So we have the highest number of nail salon workers in the US with 27,000 in the New York City metropolitan area. So this is, a large occupational sector, and it's a large occupational sector that we need to understand the exposures and try to implement controls to reduce that exposure. So if you look at the next slide here, you can see 4 different cities. New York City's in the top left panel, and this is from a New York Times article. But you can just see the density of nail salons in this area. Just an insane amount of nail salons in Manhattan. Really, really high concentrations of salons in there compared to the other cities throughout the US. Compared to San Francisco and LA, we have double the number of salons per capita in New York City. So in 2015, there was a series of articles written in the New York Times. This kind of set off a lot of the nail salon regulations within the state. So the series of articles, a lot focused on wage theft and other conditions in the salon, but one specifically looked at nail salons exposures, workers' health effects from that exposure. And again, that kicked off a lot of the new regulations within the state. So because of this, in 2016, New York State passed a series of new regulations to try to reduce that exposure. And the way that they were going to achieve reduction in exposure, kind of going back to the last speakers, was through ventilation, specifically both the local exhaust ventilation, which you talked about, and general exhaust ventilation. So it was a 2-prong effort. So they were going to control exposure at the source with your local exhaust ventilation, and then control overall indoor air quality through general exhaust ventilation. So the specific requirements was 20 cubic feet per minute per person, plus an additional amount for space. So if you look at ASHRAE regulations, that's around 25 CFM per person. And then on top of that, at every nail station, you need to have local exhaust ventilation, exhausting 50 CFM at the source. And the other provisions in this law were it had to be exhausted outside, so you couldn't recirculate the air. And the second, it had to be on continuously. So, obviously these were, really great laws in terms of protecting worker health. Where we ran into problems and why we're not seeing much local exhaust ventilation in New York City was it's incredibly costly, and the state did not put in the proper resources for training and contractors to actually install this ventilation system. So when I went out and would do recruitment for the study, I did not come across one salon that had any sort of local exhaust ventilation. talking to the salon owners, very few understood the ventilation system that they had currently, and none seemed to fully grasp how they were going to comply with this law. And one of the big barriers, again, installing general exhaust ventilation, that's fairly easy and straightforward. I mean, that's basically just tied into the existing HVAC system. Where they were having problems was with this local exhaust ventilation at each table. Obviously, it's going to change the aesthetics of the salon. It's also, I'll show you the actual dimensions of the salon in a few slides, but these salons are cramped. I mean, they're fairly small, so that meant, possibly removing some nail chairs, other stations just to fit in the ventilation system in there. And you have to have obviously duct work at each different station. So the managers, owners that we spoke to for this study, they found this incredibly challenging. They didn't feel like they were getting the proper resources from the state and local officials to really make this work. So while the law had all very good intentions in terms of protecting worker health and safety, again, as the last speaker mentioned, the local exhaust ventilation captures the exposure before it circulates around the salon. So that's obviously more protective. You're capturing it at the source, but they didn't really feel like they knew where to start. And then, here's just another schematic. The big takeaway for all this and where it came to owners and managers' concerns was, all the air had to be exhausted outdoors. So if you do the basic calculations, you're talking about 1,000 CFM, and these salons around 8,000 cubic feet. So you're looking at about an air change every 8 minutes and like 15 air changes, 12 to 15 air changes per hour. So it's a lot of air being exhausted outdoors. So as you take air, remove it, from the salon, you then need to have replacement air. And so in New York City, 6-7 months of the year, that air needs to be conditioned. So that all comes with additional costs, which, the owners, managers were somewhat concerned about. And that's because for these ventilation requirements, they had to be, continuously turned on. So our paper was published in 2019, 2020. This was actually a follow-up study to a initial study we had published earlier on. And it was, we had some initial questions from the earlier study that we sought to answer within this study. So for the study, we recruited 12 nail salons out of over 300 we approached. So, we did a fairly, blanketed targeting of, all salons in 4 boroughs, excluding Staten Island, it was harder to get to. Just walking around and dropping off recruitment material, explaining the study. The vast majority of the salons, they didn't say they, weren't interested. They just never really kind of followed up to recontact us about participating in the study. So we never really got a lot of, hard no's. It was, we'll think about it. We just, didn't really hear back from them. But, this is fairly typical for nail salon research. We were happy to get 12 salons that were interested in participating in the study. So we measured concentrations over 3 days, so Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, really to get at the temporal variability in exposures. How much did exposures change throughout the days? Initially hypothesized there would be much more variability in exposure, but I'll show you in the results, not a whole lot of variability in the salons. And so we measured TVOCs. So this was, a mixture of all VOCs in the air, volatile, organic compounds. And then we specifically looked at 3 specific compounds measured with a passive sampler. And again, kind of piggybacking off what the last speaker talked about, MMA, toluene, and ethyl acetate were the 3 components. We measured toluene because of its toxicity, MMA because of its sensitization properties, and ethyl acetate because it's usually the most abundant chemical found in nail salons. And that was more of an indicator overall indoor air quality. We also measured carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is a proxy for general ventilation in there. If you've ever visited a salon, it's pretty tricky to measure the actual ventilation rates there, especially in New York City, where you might have access to the system. So we use CO2 as a proxy for your ventilation to see if they were complying with that New York State regulations. What we used for the study in terms of the passive sampler was this Radiella passive monitor. The reason we chose this as opposed to the 3M badges that's been used more was its stability. According to the manufacturer, it would stay stable for up to 6 months. So we thought that was a little bit better given the time frame of our study and sending it off to a lab. This way this works is you have an adsorbent cartridge shown below on the right side. And basically we'd ask a salon owner to put the cartridge into this white diffusive body and leave that out for the entire working day. So they would do it in the morning and then take it out, put it back in this white tube, seal it up, and then at the end of the study we'd come pick up the sampler. What we found, and as other people doing research in this, we had great compliance with the managers, but we found we needed to send regular text reminders. So at the start of the day, a research assistant would send a text reminder to the manager, asking them to put the passive monitor out, and at the end of the day to remember to close it up, because we really want to get that working day. We don't want to leave it out. Because that really doesn't get at what the concentrations are when people are working. So to get the most accurate representation, we asked for a while, people were actually doing some sort of nail process in there. So you can see from this table here the general characteristics of the salons. As opposed to our previous study that we conducted a year prior, I think these were much more representative of salons in New York City. When we did our first study, we had a lot of higher end salons. I mean, they were, huge in terms of the space there, very few tables. The manicure would cost $60, $70. I mean, that's generally not representative of what the nail salon industry looks like in New York City. So I think in this follow-up study, we did a much better job of recruiting salons that really look like what a nail salon looks like in New York City, which are pretty small. I mean, so the volume 8,100 cubic feet. So you're looking at like a 20 by 30 by 10 salon there. I mean, fairly small. One salon was 3,000 cubic feet and had 10 nail tables and 10 pedicure stations, and fairly dense salon, small. Overall, and this goes back to why this law needed much more outreach to the nail salons. Most owners really didn't, and managers didn't understand their ventilation system. So do you exhaust all day? Only 5 exhausted all day using their general exhaust ventilation. And when you'd ask, okay, so is it exhausted outside? Is it recirculated? Most were unsure. 5 were exhausted directly outside. 2 salons had no general exhaust ventilation whatsoever, and they utilized windows to reduce exposure. That actually worked fairly well. We conducted this in the summertime, but obviously that's not a long-term solution, especially in the wintertime. On this slide here, we have the number of services performed each day in the salon, the mean number. We were hoping for more variability in the number of services by day in the salon. But realistically, there was really no difference between Thursday and Saturday in the number of services performed in the salon. Very few salons worked with artificial nails, and if they did a small number in terms of their overall services in that salon. Here we can see the overall exposure profile within all the salons that we sampled, 3 different days and the 12 different salons. TVOC concentrations were around 30 parts per million. So, I'd say that's fairly high, and that's, reflective in what you're seeing in the health effects. So overall, toluene, MMA were very low. So most of the salons had levels below the limit of detection. So, that's a good thing. Toluene is being eliminated from products. I remember reviewing one safety data sheet from, 80s, 90s, and you're looking at 10% of that nail polish was toluene. Now we're not really finding it at all in the salon. So we're doing a good job of training and eliminating that chemical from the products. But we're still replacing that with other VOCs, and that's showing up in the exposure profile. We're still seeing high levels of VOCs in the salon. If you look at the range, you often see salons for hours at a time at 100 ppm of TVOCs. So still high levels of TVOC exposure. However, we are reducing the higher toxicity chemicals. But still, you get exposed to 100 ppm VOCs. That's still going to result in the headaches, the upper respiratory problems. The nail salon workers are still, telling us about. Ethyl acetate, again, that was no surprise. Most readily found chemical in there. Looking around about 1 part per million in the salons for an average exposure.
Hey, Brian, can you start to wrap up, please?
Sure. Looking from the public health perspective, where do we take this data, and what do we find? 3 salons were compliant with your general exhaust ventilation. So they had 25 CFM per person. They exhausted all day. They didn't meet the local exhaust ventilation, but they were at least complying with the general exhaust ventilation. Those salons had the most customers, and they're the biggest spaces. And they had about a third of the concentration of TVOCs that compared to your non-compliant salons. Okay. And the non-compliant salons had fewer customers. So, granted, small sample size, can't make a lot of big conclusions from this, but, that if you're going to do targeted public health outreach, you need to start with the smaller salons that actually have fewer customers, because the larger ones that are doing more business seem to actually, be complying with the regulations. And I guess I'll just skip that in interest of time and just go to the conclusions here. From my conversations with the salon managers, owners, they're not prepared for these regulations. 25% of the salons met your general exhaust requirements, but none had the local exhaust for all those reasons I mentioned earlier. In terms of public health knowledge, they're not understanding their ventilation system. They couldn't really answer basic questions about it. Considering this is our biggest tool, that the owners can to reduce their exposure, we're not doing a very good job of explaining its importance, how it works, etc. And just overall looking at the exposure conclusions, day-to-day variations in exposure were limited. So basically, if you worked in a salon with bad indoor air quality, that indoor air quality was bad every day. The salons with good indoor air quality obviously had good indoor air quality every day. And they were the ones that were complying with the New York State regulations. Obviously, we can reduce exposures further by implementing the local exhaust ventilation systems. but there needs to be a better job by the city and state in doing outreach to these salons to help them understand them and how to install them. And then, finally, I just want to acknowledge the co-authors of the study for all their help on this, and the New Jersey ERC, which provided funding for this project.